So you can go ahead and
Okay.
tell us what we're talking about. And I'm going to take off my hat.
Yeah, I picked the song Building a Mystery because I think that the more I dialogue with apologists, the more I feel like that's what's happening. So the more they talk, the less I understand about what it is they're trying to explain to me. And in a recent conversation that was on the TV list, I just had no luck in getting somebody to explain to me the very small phrase. It sounds like nothing. God exists. And it's a very small phrase. It's 2 words. And yet those 2 words are complete mystery. There's nothing in them that I understand as far as getting somebody to explain to me what they mean by God and getting somebody to explain to me how they're using the term exists. And the problem that I wanted to read a couple of responses that I got in order to illustrate the problem.
Because it shouldn't be a problem. I mean,
really
if you say like butterflies exist,
right.
We're kind of talking in the same language, and
Right.
we've got definition and understanding of each other.
Right, and that's a great example, okay? So if you say to me that a butterfly exists, even if I have no idea what a butterfly is, you can very easily describe it to me. It's, they range in size. They can be tiny or they can be about that big. Sometimes they get, real big if they have big wings. But they have, for the most part, colorful patterned wings that are, kind of opaque generally, sometimes iridescent. They've got I think they have 6 legs, maybe 8, I don't know. But antenna, the proboscis kind of tongue, they eat. Now, you can give me a very detailed description of what you mean by a butterfly when you're saying it. And if everything else fails, we can go outside and you can grab me and say, there's a butterfly.
Right.
So there's a referent in reality that we can point to, and even if we don't have that referent available, we can offer a very detailed description of what exactly you mean by butterfly. So even if you're talking to someone who lives in Antarctica, you can still describe the thing to them in terms that they can understand. It has wings, it has legs, it has, and so it's a very, there's a way, it's well defined, it's observable, it manifests, it's a fairly obvious item, and so it's very easy to get past that first part, butterflies. And then exists would pretty much be along the lines of how you would normally use it. I think if I said to if I just walked into a room and said, give me an example of something that exists, I think most people would grab whatever's sitting there and just say, oh, okay, existence is, here. Well, what do we mean by that? We mean manifestation. The thing directly, observably, manifests, and you can measure the manifestation. We can measure how hard this mug is. We can measure the weight of, Muhammad. You can measure light frequencies. There's like a whole range of measurements for existence, and basically things that manifest and things that can be measured are what we consider to be the realm of existence and what we're talking about when we say exist. So when I get into a discussion with an apologist, we have 2 problems. The first one, of course, is that they're giving me the item, God, which has no external referent that they can generally point to. There are some exceptions to this, like the pantheists we use a lot, because they put forward that the universe is God, and so to them, all of this would be God. And on some level, that's almost like also a Hindu idea, where you've got the divinity of everything. So, but you're putting forward that if everything is God to a person, I may or may not agree that I would call it God, but at least they're able to communicate to me what they mean by the term God.
Right, and
and that's what it is to them. And that's what happens when you deal with a concept, but that isn't what happens when you deal with a referent.
Right.
When you have an external objective referent like this mug, there's not a lot of discrepancy as far as what color is this, how hard is this, how deep is this. I mean, it's measurable. And whether somebody wants to believe that it's, maybe 4 inches deep or not is really, certainly they can believe that, but they can be proven wrong.
Yeah.
And you can show that the mug is as deep as the mug is by simply pulling out a ruler. Argue with you about that, because most atheists will agree that God is a concept, a model in your mind. But if you want to say that there is an objectively existing entity of some sort, something outside your head that exists in the external realm of existent reality, of objectively existing reality beyond yourself, then that whole idea of God exists like love exists doesn't apply anymore.
Right.
So now we're looking at an objective reality, which is a measurable reality, and where the way that we know and test a concept, so if me and Matt get into an argument about whether or not this mug is deeper than 2 inches or not deeper than 2 inches, it can be resolved. We simply have to examine the mug, measure how many inches deep it is, and we will know who is correct and who is incorrect. Where you lack an external referent, the problem becomes, upon what do you base your model? Okay, and that's a big problem, because if there's nothing upon which to base your model and somebody makes a claim about God, God is loving, well, I can't measure that. I don't know. You're claiming that, but I don't know, and I can't check your claim against the external referent to see if what you're telling me is accurate. So without having something to examine, I have your claim or someone else's claim, but I have nothing to examine in order to confirm that claim is accurate.
Yeah, and in order for the concept to actually work, I mean, going back to like the mug analogy, not only do you need to be able to define it specifically and explain it, but we need to be using common terms. And that means that if we're going to measure how deep that is, we need a standardized unit of measure that we're
Correct.
both going to agree on.
Right.
So that, you know, I don't all of a sudden say that, well, when I say 2 inches, that equals 2 feet for you.
Correct.
And you hear similar things with regard to this God claim as well, you know.
So we run into an issue where the person, if they want to have a dialogue about God, they need to be able to explain what it is they're describing, what it is they're referring to, what it is that I'm supposed to be acknowledging. And I wanted to read some excerpts from one of the dialogues that happened recently, because it gives a really good example of the problem that occurs. And when you're an atheist and you're trying to talk to somebody about their concept of God, it becomes problematic when they give you answers like this. I'm sorry about that. If I could explain God in the way you want me to, then I would pretty much be a God myself. His glory is too great even to come close to understanding anything about the nature of his existence. And another response we got to someone else on the same question is, and it's the same person putting this out, but by no means is this person unique in their description. I mean, this is not something that we rarely hear. This is par for the course. Here he is again trying to describe it. This is the awesome glory of God. I don't have a clue as to what he is, none whatsoever. This is what makes him so magnificent, because there is nothing in this world that could explain or describe or imagine what his glory is like. We only say God and he because it is the best way for us to identify who we are talking about, but that doesn't describe what he is like or what he is made of or anything. A thing we can describe, God we cannot. And let me tell you that the last part of that paragraph is something that most atheists would give a hearty amen to, because it does seem like a thing you can describe, but God you cannot. And it also seems like we don't know who or what, or what we're talking about or anything about it. So if this is the description that I'm getting back, and I'm trying to have a conversation with someone about God exists, and I can't get past God, I don't know how to have that conversation.
Yeah, and I, while I wouldn't have phrased it this way, and I certainly wouldn't have started with this is the awesome glory of God, the idea that you're saying, I believe in this thing that I can't possibly understand, I can't comprehend, I can't even imagine, I can't describe, I can't know anything about. Why would anybody believe in that?
Well, what is
what
that?
Is it you're believing in?
Right.
I mean, how can you say that I can't comprehend it, but I believe it?
Right.
I can't understand it, I can't describe it, but I believe it.
Right. I mean, I don't know
get
what it is I'm supposed to be understanding that you believe when this is the response. I have no idea what, I mean, if you can't make sense of it and you can't understand it, how in the world can you possibly expect to communicate that to someone else?
And what does that say, for example, if we extend it into what they're normally talking about, where this is a God that created you, and he specifically created you in a manner that you're unable to comprehend, understand, identify, describe, or in any way know anything about it. Now, I realize that not all believers necessarily fall into this category, but if you're in that category, if you can't, I mean, you don't even know what this thing is that you don't understand, and yet you're believing it, and then eventually you get the justification that I believe it because, you know, he made me, or he made everything, that type of thing. Well, how do you know that? How do you know there's any there? I mean, it's just, it's maddening.
Well, I mean, it's basically a description of nothing. I mean, it's a description of nothing, and then I'm supposed to talk about it like it's something. And I don't know how to do that. And I think that's what I'm trying to say today is there is a definitional divide, I think, between like apologists and atheists that it's no wonder to me that communication doesn't happen or that it's so difficult when a person who is offering that sort of a description for God does not understand the non-information they're providing. They're providing me a whole bunch of words and saying nothing. They're describing nothing. They have given me zero information in that paragraph. They've just spent an entire paragraph explaining to me why they can't explain to me God, and yet they want to dialogue with me about God. Well, if I want to have a conversation with someone about God, they have got to be able to tell me what they're talking about. If you can't tell me what you're talking about, there cannot be a conversation. So I would say before you approach somebody to discuss your God, you need to sit down and do some reflection and try to figure out what you mean by that word, specifically what you mean. And I also don't mean what do you think God does. I mean, what do you think God is? Because what you think God does is really irrelevant until there is shown to be a God that is. You can tell me all day long, God creates worlds, God wrote the Bible, God, and I cannot confirm any of it because I have no God to go to and examine and say, you know what, that's correct, this God did write the Bible. And that's the other problem that we had with this particular person was the idea that the evidence that was being put forward on behalf of his God's existence all assumed that God existed. So you would have the Bible put forward, and it's like, well, God created the Bible, and so here's the Bible, and this is evidence for God. And it's like, well, but if there is no God, then God didn't create that book. So you can't come to me when what we're trying to determine is whether or not there is a God and say you've got this book that is the product of that God, and you want to enter that into evidence for your God, and I should accept it as evidence because it was created by your God. Well, if the point of contention is whether or not God exists, of course I'm not going to accept that the book is created by God. We need to establish first there is a God that could create the book. Then we can talk about whether or not he did create the book.
There may be a good test too, though. I mean, if you're doing it in written communication, take a second, because you know, looking at what the person wrote, if you take out your gods and he's and it's, if you want, and sub in something,
I put X
or
a lot of times.
Nothing,
right.
Or XPDR, just in any string of characters, and it makes as much sense if you're conveying exactly no information either way,
right,
then there's a problem.
Right. And we're going to get to that too. The other question that comes up is what is meant by exist? So we go through the whole thing with God. We can't define God. We don't understand God. I have no more information about God. And then I'm wondering, if you can't give me any data and you have no way to measure, to examine, then what do you mean by exist? Because when I use the term exist, I'm talking about the measurable, objective reality around me. And if I can't, if there's no measurable way to examine this thing that you're talking about, how then is it that you're considering it part of existence, and what do you mean by the word exist at this point, and how do you tell things that exist from things that do not if we're going to include non-manifesting items in the realm of existent items? That becomes a problem. So what I wrote to the person was that existence, as far as I know, is the term we use to define the set of all items that can be shown to directly manifest to people. To say that any item exists indicates that it manifests in some direct manner. If you cannot show a direct manifestation of any God, then you have no actual reason to put forward a God exists. If existence is not manifestation to you, please define the term exist as you apply it, And if your use of exist does not require direct manifestation, please explain how you differentiate between things that exist and things that do not exist. I assume I should clarify that you're putting forward God exists in the present and not that God is merely a past event that no longer exists, such as a deist might put forward. To me, that question is very clear. How do you define existence? How do you tell the difference between things that exist and things that don't if you're not using manifestation as your measure? I don't know how I could have been any more clear. The answer I got back is, for this, you'll need faith. I can't show you God. God will show himself to you in his own ways when you have faith. And trust me, you'll know it's him, but it's all up to you. The best I can do is show you the truth about Jesus, who is the manifestation of God in human flesh. Now, all I asked was, how do you define existence, and how do you tell things that exist from things that do not? And the answer I got back was, I can't show you God. Okay, I didn't ask him to show me God. I didn't ask him how I can see God. I didn't ask him, all I said was, how do you define existence, and how do you tell things that exist from things that do not? And I did not get an answer to the question.
Unless you ask the question, how do you tell the difference between things that exist and things that don't? And if you take his first sentence, for this you'll need faith, maybe that was his answer. I just take it on faith that whatever I happen to believe in actually exists.
My point is that the question I asked really is divorced from, can be divorced from whether or not we're even talking about God.
Right.
How do you define existence, and how do you tell things that exist from things that don't?
No, I'm saying his answer may, I don't think it's, I'm being kind of funny.
Well, yeah, but I'm just saying, I mean, yes, I wouldn't probably accept that he is saying I need faith for everything.
It's really a way of saying, I don't try to tell the difference between what exists and what doesn't exist.
Maybe
if I feel like believing in unicorns, I'll just take that on faith.
He couldn't show me God. I said, if God does not manifest like every other existent item manifests, what are you defining as existence? Again, I didn't say, if God doesn't manifest like every other item that exists manifests, so therefore your God doesn't exist. All I said was, what are you defining as existence? If God doesn't manifest like every other item manifests in existence, what are you defining as existence? That's a very straightforward question. The answer I got was, you want a natural explanation for a supernatural being. That doesn't work. Apparently you think supernatural isn't that super and just a tad bit more than natural. The best thing we have are miracles he's performed for us in our lives. That's the manifestation you're going to get. Again, I didn't ask for an explanation about, all I said was, what are you defining as existence? And no answer. No answer. I get more of an apology about God and why you can't, and I'm not asking him, why can't we see God? I'm saying, what are you defining as existence? And I got no answer. I don't know what he means by existence. So I tried again. I said, I'm unbiased enough to be willing to accept that you have some sort of a God that exists if your God can meet the one and only criteria I am aware of for existence, measurable manifestation. When I ask you what you mean when you then mean by exist and existence, and how you tell things that exist from things that do not, you say I'm putting constraints on God. I'm not. I'm merely asking you, and I put that in all caps, you, to define what you mean by exist and existence, and how you differentiate that which exists from that which does not. I'm not asking God to provide anything in this request. I'm questioning your model and your definitions and your lack of support. I'm not asking anything from God. And then the answer I got was, do I believe that Jesus is a real person? I know that at least you once did, but what about now? Trust me, I'm not dodging your question. All right, so we really didn't get, I never got an explanation for what does he mean by exist and how does he define it and how he tells things that exist from things that don't exist. And the answer about Jesus is, I think I understand what he's trying to do, but the problem is that Jesus, lived and died, and even if Jesus at the time he lived was some sort of human manifestation, the problem is we don't have that now. And my point to him earlier was, you're not talking about a past God that used to exist. You're talking about a God that you believe exists right now, which means that you're saying this thing is right now. So why isn't it manifesting right now? Why do we have to go back 2,000 years to look for a manifestation of something you say is here now? I mean, it's not, there's a difference between saying it used to be. In that case, I can understand trying to pull from some sort of evidentiary argument about why we would think something used to be. But when you're saying something is, you're making a claim about current state of existence. And so I need to know, currently, when you say God exists, what are you saying about existence? What does it mean to you to exist? And how do you tell a thing that exists from something that doesn't exist? And that has to be clear. And also what has to be clear is what you're talking about when you say God. What is it that is striking you about the world outside you, or what's beyond your brain, that makes you say, yes, this thing is out there? What are you seeing? What are you experiencing? What is it that you're calling God? What is that referent that's outside your mind? Is there one? Or is there not? And if there's not, then please don't be surprised that I don't believe you. And if there is, then explain it and let's talk about it. But anyway, the next thing that we tried to discuss was, I was trying to make the point, and it seems to me like a no-brainer, but it was so difficult. And the whole time I was responding to this person, I remember I just kept thinking, why is this hard? Why is this hard? And there was a few times I actually wrote that, and I would say, this does not have to be this hard. Telling me what you mean by existence shouldn't entail a huge explanation about your God. I'm just asking you in general, what do you mean by existence? That's a very simple thing. When you're talking about things that exist and things that don't exist, what do you mean by that? And if you don't know what you mean by it, then what you're really saying is you don't know what existence is. And if you don't know what you mean by exist and existence, then how can you make a claim that something exists when you don't know what that means? So you've got to have something in your head that is existence.
And you're about to any other thing that you can do when we haven't even gotten past the basics. And in this case, we're having a difficult time even getting the basics of two words.
Right. Which are the entire claim.
Yeah.
I mean, there's only two parts to the claim. God exists. And the person can't tell me what God is, and they can't. And they're using exist in a way that is obviously not the standard way that it's normally used, but they won't tell me how they're using it. So I have no idea what the claim means. When you're telling me God exists and you cannot explain to me what God is, and you cannot tell me what you mean by existence, I don't know what you're claiming.
Yeah, and if you try to assume,
yeah,
if you try to go with like a generalized definition of God,
right,
in order to get to specifics that they can't do, inevitably, without fail, they'll come back, well, that's not the God that I know.
Yeah, that will consistently...
You're unfairly putting words in my mouth. Well, if you won't put them in there, then we're done.
Right. That will consistently bite you in the ass to make an assumption about what somebody means when they say God. Because I guarantee you, I have not met two theists who mean the same thing by that word. I have not met the two theists that worship the same God. And the next thing that I was trying to is that things that do not exist cannot be the cause of other things. And this became extremely problematic because the theist in this case was interpreting me to be saying, God cannot be the cause of things because God does not exist. So he was thinking that I was presupposing the atheist stance and therefore saying that God cannot be the cause of anything because God doesn't exist. That is not what I was saying. What I was trying to communicate to the theist in this case is that if there is no God, God cannot be the cause of other things. And you can say that about anything. If there is no pen, then the pen cannot be the cause of anything. Now, that doesn't mean that we have to start with a presupposition, I guess, that there is no God. But what I am going to start with is that we need to establish that there is a God before we can start moving forward and saying that that God causes things, that that God manifested as Jesus, that that God wrote a Bible, that that God produced a universe. Maybe it did, but let's sit down and say, do we have an existent God? Is God an existent thing that can cause other things? Because until we have that part down, we can't move forward.
Right. If something, basically, one of the claims from people about God is that it is this, well, it doesn't manifest because it's this transcendent, otherworldly, outside of reality being. Then what you're saying is it can't therefore affect reality in any way at all, because the second it does, it has by definition manifested in some way. There are lots of things that we can't or couldn't see or identify, and yet we saw their effects this led us to hypotheses about what they potentially were, and we began investigating to measure and identify how those things manifest. Couldn't see atoms for a very long time, and yet we began to build an understanding of the fundamental building blocks of everything in the universe that led us to, well, I mean, the ancient Greeks had some sort of atomic theory long before anybody could have actually seen or measured one. And that's just one of the many examples. If there is some effect or some observation, some phenomena in reality, it doesn't matter whether it's caused by something else in reality or, if you're willing to go this far, something else outside of reality, there's something there that we can look at. That's the manifestation. And if you think your God can do things in reality, then by definition he's become measurable and identifiable and quantifiable.
Did you want to